This is Dr. Timothy Lewis. Welcome to the first episode of Matthewlinity. This is a podcast series about critical study of the Gospel of Matthew and masculinity. I'm a little bit nervous and excited about starting a podcast. In this first episode, I will be doing three things. So there are three parts to this episode. First, I'll spend a few minutes introducing the agenda of the podcast. Then I'll be talking about the traditional name attached to the book of Matthew. What did it originally mean to call the book the Gospel According to Matthew? Thirdly and finally, I'll be asking some questions about how we think about the authorship of the book of Matthew. Okay, part 1. The name and aim of this podcast. There are three aspects to the name of the podcast: critical study, Matthew, and masculinity. So if we break it down into three questions: why a critical study, why Matthew, and why masculinity? First, what do I mean by critical study? By critical study, I mean providing a critique or offering an analysis or commentary, much like a film critic might give a detailed analysis of a film, or how a book critic would give an analysis of a book. Also by critical study, I mean that I think it's essential and crucial because I think we need a renewed discussion about our interpretation of the book of Matthew. Some of the most important interpretations of Matthew are not very well known, and many of the most well-known interpretations are not very well understood. I intend to raise the difficult questions in a way that honours previous scholarship as well as pushes scholarship forward, and to do so in a way that is accessible to students as well as scholars. In my analysis, I tried to value a variety of perspectives and to bring a variety of questions to the text. I should also say what I don't mean by critical. I don't mean denigrating or looking for faults. I remember being given some good advice when I was first starting out on my PhD. Advice about demonstrating my own analysis without demolishing the work of others. I was advised not to spend my time pointing out the faults of other scholars, but instead focus on what I could contribute to the conversation. And I still think this is good advice. Why study the book of Matthew? There are several reasons why I'm interested in Matthew. One reason is because I find Matthew more intriguing the more I study it, and I enjoy noticing things that not many other people have noticed. I also like trying to figure out something that previous commentators have been unable to resolve. And there are plenty of unsolved problems in Matthew. I'm also interested in Matthew because of my PhD, in which I studied the meanings of a few Greek and Syriac words occurring in Matthew and in Mark in both the Greek and Syriac versions. And the majority of my examples came from Matthew. So I think the time I spent studying these words in Matthew stirred my interest. Also, one of my dissertation examiners was Warren Carter, who is a renowned Matthean scholar, and I was very encouraged by his review of my thesis. So I'm embarking on a long-term research project. So far I've spent over a year examining the first chapter of Matthew. I'm hoping that podcasting is a way for me to gather my thoughts and help me in the process of publishing my ongoing research. Okay, so why study masculinity? Or more to the point, why do I want to combine studies in Matthew with studies in masculinity? The short answer is, as far as I know, no one has yet written a commentary on Matthew that takes into account insights from masculinity studies, which seems remiss considering that the person who is thought to have compiled and published the book was a man, especially since the book often assumes to be speaking to an audience of men. For example, much of Jesus' first Sermon from the Mountain assumes to be addressing men. Also, most interpretations of Matthew presume that the person who compiled compiled and published the book was a man. Perhaps we could just go on reading Matthew as though gender were unimportant, as though all the stuff that's about men and addressed to men is not necessarily just about men. But wouldn't this undermine our ability to discern and understand what's actually in the text, and undermine our engagement with the text? So I don't think it's a good idea to ignore the gendered nature of the text, or to ignore the gender of the writer. This is something that I'll talk about in part 3 of this episode. I should probably also point out what masculinity studies is not, since many people who are unfamiliar with it might imagine that it's some kind of reaction against feminist studies, or a corrective against feminism. So when I was telling my sister that I wanted to incorporate masculinity studies into my research on Matthew, she said, "But I thought you were a feminist." I explained that yes, masculinity studies depends on and grows out of feminist research. Both fields of study belong within what many now call gender studies. So what's the difference between feminist studies in Matthew and masculinity studies in Matthew? Feminist research in Matthew often focuses on the female characters in the narrative, how the women have been depicted in the text, how they might have been obscured by the text, and how they have been interpreted by readers past and present. Feminist research often works towards reclaiming women's voices, voices that might otherwise be lost, and raising the profile of women past and present in our interpretations of the text. So why study the masculinity or masculinities in Matthew? The idea of studying masculinity is relatively recent. It's only been developed in recent decades. It arises from the realization that simply studying the gender of women might potentially be reinforcing the idea that women were being studied because they were different to the norm, and meanwhile neglecting that the gender of men should be critically studied. It should not be passed over as if we already understand it. So a study of masculinity is often a study of what's hidden in plain sight. Even though the men and women in Matthew have been previously researched, when it comes to studying gender, only really the gender of the women has been considered. The gender of the men has not been given much thought, which often ends up reinforcing the idea that the gender of men is simply normal gender, as if the gender of men is somehow unremarkably neutral. I first became aware of this idea about 20 years ago, when I noticed how television was promoting the assumption that it was easier to just ignore gender when men were selling the products and men were delivering the voiceovers than for women doing the very same thing. As if the gender of women was something that was more noticeable or more publicly apparent than the gender of the men. The presumed idea was the gender of the men could be more easily taken out of focus, and men and male voices could be more easily seen as disembodied without drawing attention to their bodies or their masculinity. Probably the best example of what I'm talking about is mentioned by Ketya Ali, who is currently an associate professor at Boston University. She recalls being at a history seminar about 20 years ago and hearing a fellow student refer to women as people of gender. What? Presuming only women have gender? The idea that women are marked with gender, but not men, is the very reason we need to study masculinity. The presumption that men have a normal gender is a problem and needs to be recognized as a problem. The idea that gender doesn't really need discussing when studying men is precisely why we need to consider masculinity when interpreting the Matthewan text. We need to identify and unravel the presumptions around masculinity, and we need to study the men in Matthew and not to overlook what's being assumed about gender by the people in the text and by the people reading the text. It's an essential part of examining the cultural assumptions at work in the text, not only in the story world of the text, but also in the world behind the text, the social world that produced the text, and also the world in front of the text, the social world of modern readers. In summary, the men in Matthew have hardly ever been analysed in terms of their gender, because they weren't really considered to have a peculiar kind of gender. But the gender of the men is just as peculiar as the gender of the women. So how can we expect to understand one particular gender without looking at the whole system of gender? It would seem to be negligent not to consider how influential masculinity may be in its various forms for readers past and present. Any serious interpretation of the text cannot afford to overlook the study of masculinity, especially a text that is already explicitly interested in men. I had originally thought of naming the podcast either Matthewversity or Well Versed in Matthew, but I needed a name like Masculinity that would constantly remind me to include masculinity as I try to offer critical insights into the study of Matthew. Hopefully that summarizes the name and aim of the podcast. Now for part 2. Now in part 2, I would like to talk about the name of the book that is placed first in the New Testament. The book that I've so far been calling the Book of Matthew. What scholars sometimes call the first Gospel because of its being placed in first position. Not because it's the oldest Gospel. The Gospel of Mark is apparently older than Matthew. Now, I must confess that I find talking about the name of the book much more difficult than talking about the book itself. I would much prefer to just jump straight into talking about verse 1 of Matthew, because I'm more comfortable in discussing the book's content than discussing the book's title. Notice that I'm implying that there is a difference between the book and its title, and this is really the main point of this section of the episode. All the other points flow out from this one point. Even if listeners remember nothing else from this entire episode, except that the book and the book's title are separate issues, then that's my goal achieved. The book and the name of the book are distinct matters of interpretation. The book's title is not intrinsically part of the book itself. So, in other words, the traditional title that's attached to the text is not part of what scholars call the text. This episode, I'm talking about the part that comes before verse 1, the book's title, Gospel According to Matthew. Although the title is not part of the text, it traditionally belongs with the text. So when was the title added to the text? And what was the meaning of the title? What did it originally mean to call the book the Gospel According to Matthew? These are questions that I will try and answer now. I'm not completely confident about pinning down the exact meaning of the book's title without knowing when or where the title comes from. All I can do at this stage is to give you my thinking and make some educated guesses. So I'll try and take you through my thinking for both parts of the book's title. So, Gospel according to Matthew. Before doing this podcast, I thought I could avoid the whole debate about when the book's title was added. I thought it didn't really matter to me what point in time the book's title was added. Whether it was added immediately when the book was published or added many decades later, I thought it didn't matter, but I've found that it is much more difficult to interpret the name of the book in the context of the first century. This is mainly because the early Christians never referred to the book by its traditional title until after the middle of the 2nd century. So there are reasons that push the book's title later into the 2nd century, but there are also reasons that pull aspects of the title back earlier into the 1st century. Let's begin with what the book's title isn't. The book's title is not the Gospel of Matthew. That's a shorter version of the title. The traditional title is the Gospel According to Matthew, which in Greek is Evangelion kata Mattheon. Evangelion according to Matthew, or Evangel According to Matthew. I'll be using the word Evangel instead of Evangelion for simplicity. And I'll be using the word Evangel interchangeably with the word Gospel. So the traditional title is Evangel According to Matthew. So what did Evangel According to Matthew mean? People often think that it meant a gospel narrative written by Matthew. Well, no, that's a later development we find in the late 2nd century. So if the book's title is late, from the late 100s, then I guess we could say that the late 2nd century Christians thought that the book's title meant a gospel story written by Matthew. But if the book's title is much earlier, then Gospel According to Matthew, or Evangel According to Matthew, then the meaning of the word Evangel most probably does not indicate something written. Perhaps we could better capture the idea of what it meant by thinking of it as saying, this is the Evangel as told by Matthew. Evangel seems to be a message about Jesus, not a book about Jesus. I should say this again. Prior to the mid-2nd century, so prior to the 140s and 150s, the Evangel was not a book. The Evangel meant a message, a verbally communicated message, not a book. The idea of equating the Evangel with a book is a later idea we find in the late 2nd century. Christians were not talking about Gospels in the plural until later on in the 2nd century. Until that time, different books of the Gospel were simply known as the Gospel or the Lord's Gospel. So, what exactly did the book's title mean, presuming for now that it is earlier than the mid-2nd century? Many people are quite familiar with the term Gospel, more so than the term Evangel. And many people have learnt that the word Gospel means the good news. And yes, in some contexts, Evangel can be translated as the good news, especially when it is the verb evangelize, to bring the good news, as when a royal messenger brings the good news from a king, or to a king, or about a king. Evangel has a socio-political aspect which is not well expressed by the English the good news. The phrase the good news doesn't really indicate where the message has come from, or that the message concerns the enthronement of a king, or the monarch's political victory and the results that affected the people. The noun evangel is difficult to find an exact English equivalent, partly because it's used differently by different authors and in different contexts. But for present purposes, I'll give you my top 3 English translations for the noun evangel. Number 1, the proclamation. The proclamation is a helpful translation because it indicates the significance of something proclaimed. Unfortunately, it doesn't explain what is proclaimed. Number 2, the announcement. The announcement is helpful because it indicates that it comes from somewhere official, or from someone important, or someone acting officially. But the announcement doesn't indicate what is being announced. Number 3, message of salvation. The message of salvation is helpful because it indicates the content of the message, namely salvation. The word salvation refers to the people's welfare within the kingdom in which they live. So the word salvation translates the ev in Evangel, literally welfare message, or well-being message, or wellness message. So, combining all three together, we can think of the Evangel according to Matthew as indicating the royal announcement of salvation according to Matthew. So, if we presume that the book's title is very early, almost as old as the book itself, then it most probably does not indicate a book. The problem is we cannot interpret the meaning of the book's title in isolation. We cannot interpret the book's title in isolation from other books that also proclaim the Evangel. In order to interpret the name of the book of Matthew, we have to recognize that other books share a matching book title. So, Evangel According to Matthew is not entirely unique. The title of our book actually belongs to a series of book titles. Evangel According to Mark, Evangel According to Luke, Evangel According to John. We need to understand the meaning of these titles as a group. What was the reason for having a set of uniform book titles? The answer pushes us in the direction of the mid-2nd century. The idea of having standardized gospel titles became very useful to a community when they began using more than one book of the gospel. They could no longer just say, "Today we'll be hearing from the gospel." They also wanted to indicate which version of the gospel they were reading from. A second purpose for having standardized gospel titles was that it was intended to hold a group of gospel books together in unity. So the titles are what we might think of today as a series or box set. At exactly what stage the book's titles were included, we don't know. We know that the standardized book titles were a way of differentiating between different books of the gospel. We know that they were intended to hold several books together as a group. We know that the standardized gospel titles imply a collection that became known as the fourfold gospel. We know that no Christian authors were referring to these books by these traditional titles until after the mid-2nd century. We know that before the mid-2nd century, Christian authors who quoted from books of the gospel simply quoted them as being from the gospel or from the gospel of the Lord. We know that later on in the 2nd century, Christian authors were interested in the titles of these books, and this is why some scholars suggest that this is when the book titles were added. The gospel titles may be early or they may be late. The most important factor for considering the date of the book titles is the figure of Marcion. Marcion, who is probably around the year 140, and he is using a short gospel, a short version of the Gospel of Luke. So Marcion popularized the idea of only having one book of the Gospel. It's also possible that Marcion popularized the book's title in calling the book the Gospel and in beginning to associate the Gospel with a book. It's not clear what Marcion's original intentions were in using just one book for the Gospel. It's not clear that he deliberately rejected all the other Gospels or whether he only had one Gospel to start with and then just stuck to that one. I think the practical reasons come into play in having one book that you can fit in one codex. So the early Christians were early adopters of book technology, where a book could be written in a book format rather than in a scroll format. This meant that the words in a gospel codex format are much more readily available to peruse and find different portions and to read from different portions. So in the year 140, book technology has not yet developed to include several gospel books into one codex. Practically, it's easier to just use one gospel than to try and use 3 or 4 gospel books. And this is also how I think we should perceive later on in the 2nd century Tatian's combined gospel. Tatian combines or stitches together an abbreviated gospel, a Reader's Digest abridged gospel version, and during this time, in the 170s and 180s, the idea of using a combined abridged gospel that would fit into one book became very popular. Tatian's mixed gospel or combined gospel was said to be called diatessaron, which basically means made of 4. But it's not clear if that was what it was originally called. It seems to be what it was later on called. We don't know if it was called made of 4 because we don't actually know if it was made of 4 gospel books or whether it was made of 5 or more books of the gospel. We call this kind of mixed gospel today a gospel harmony. So the idea seems to be to make a single gospel version from multiple books, not simply so that it simplifies the books necessarily, but I think the main point of using an abbreviated gospel is that it fits easily into a single codex, a single book format. This is because book technology was not yet advanced enough to expect to be able to fit 3 or 4 gospel books into a single codex. So the kind of mixed gospel that Tatian is using doesn't have multiple accounts of Jesus' baptism or transfiguration. There's not 3 or 4 versions of Jesus' baptism or several versions of Jesus' resurrection. It's just a shorter gospel that combines various ones together. So in the middle of the 2nd century, the idea of having multiple books that proclaim the gospel of Jesus was an issue that was solved in different ways. Marcion solved it by just sticking to one gospel, the one that he thought was the most pure. Tatian solved it by shortening several gospels into one book. Tatian's mixed gospel immediately became very popular in the Syriac-speaking churches. In fact, it seems to have been the very first book of the gospel that the Syriac-speaking churches were introduced to, and this mixed gospel was used for several centuries. Marcion's version of Christianity became immediately very popular, and the idea of choosing a gospel and what other books the Christian churches would be using, that idea is very strong in Marcion's version of Christianity and is probably what prompted other Christians to start thinking about which books they were going to use and which books they were going to collect together. And so which books were going to be called by these standardized titles. So it makes a lot of sense, it makes a lot of sense to me to think of the middle of the 2nd century as the context that prompted the need to include more than one gospel book. So the book titles are actually intended to be inclusive of more than one book, which is possibly a response to what we find in Marcion's exclusive use of one gospel book. I would also suggest that it's just a small step from calling the book the Gospel According to Matthew, and then thinking of it as a book, as a written gospel. So even though the intention behind standardized gospel titles was to hold them together as proclaiming the same gospel, it's just a small step to then think of the gospel as a written text, or even as multiple books, as multiple gospels, as we later came to think of them. Okay, I still need to explain the meaning of according to Matthew. What did it mean to say according to Matthew? Now, some scholars have pointed out how unusual it is that it's according to Matthew and not of Matthew. And yes, if we expected it to be saying written by Matthew, we would probably expect it to be of Matthew, not according to Matthew. We would have expected to be called Evangelion Matthew, Evangel of Matthew, and especially so in later times, in the late 2nd century, when the gospel was something written. The problem with this suggestion is that even if the title had have been Gospel of Matthew, it still might not indicate written by Matthew because of the ambiguity of. The early Christians were quite familiar with the ambiguity of Gospel of. My point is that it's not Gospel of Matthew, but it could have just as easily been Gospel of Matthew, considering that of doesn't need to mean written by, it can be ambiguous. So what does according to mean? Well, it turns out that according to is really just another way of saying of. It's really just another way, it's a slightly longer way of saying of. I would suggest this alternate way of saying of is a way of putting the emphasis on the previous part. According to Matthew becomes the secondary part. Perhaps we could imagine a comma before according to. The Gospel according to Matthew. The Gospel according to Mark. By saying it this way, we can hear that the emphasis is meant to be on the first part, which is intended to unite the versions together. So, why according to Matthew? So far I've only been talking about what the name of the book means by discussing matters external to the book. I haven't yet talked about the figure of Matthew as he appears within the book. But there is one more matter to mention first, the matter of Papias. I should say something about Papias and why I won't be trying to resolve what Papias had to say about Matthew. Many people have decided to look at what Papias had to say about Matthew, and if I were keen to keep looking outside the book, I would go straight to look at Papias and try to work out what he had to say about the Apostle Matthew and the book allegedly published by Matthew. The reason why so many people are interested in discussing what Papias had to say about Matthew is because the quotation from Papias is apparently very early, from the early 100s, at the beginning of the 2nd century. But the problem is that what Papias had to say is extremely ambiguous and represents a highly debated topic which leads to all sorts of difficulties of interpretation as to what Papias was talking about. What book? was Papias talking about? Nobody knows, but many people have their opinions. Papias apparently said, "Whereas Matthew arranged the oracles in the Hebrew speech, others each interpreted them as best they could." For the time being, the only thing I'm willing to conclude about this is that Papias thought that Matthew was the first disciple to write a book. Actually, this is really three minor conclusions. One, that the figure of Matthew was already associated with a book at the beginning of the 2nd century, much earlier than the Gospel book titles were formalized in the middle of the 2nd century. So the idea that the name of Matthew should be attached to a book about Jesus predates the book's official title by about half a century. 2. That Matthew was thought to be able to write down the teachings of Jesus. This idea might even be found within the book of Matthew. I'll get back to this idea in a minute. 3 is simply the idea that it was Matthew who was thought to be the first disciple to write down Jesus' teaching. I'd like now to look at the figure of Matthew as he appears in the book itself, and to talk about Richard Bauckham's theory of the naming of the book after the Apostle Matthew. This is where things get really interesting, because I finally get to say something about what's in the book. First, I need to point out a particular tension between the book and the book's title, between what the book has to say and what the book's title appears to be saying. There is something about the name of the book which seems at odds with the book itself. The name of the book seems to presume that the Apostle Matthew was the book's author, or at least that it was being published in the name of Matthew with his authority, whereas the book itself is not interested in speaking from the perspective of Matthew. The writer's perspective does not appear to be Matthew's perspective. In the book of Matthew, the disciple Matthew appears relatively late in the book. Matthew is not one of the important early disciples, and isn't even there for Jesus' big inaugural sermon from the mountain. Although the book's title apparently claims the authority of the Apostle Matthew, whoever is writing the book does not claim to be Matthew. The book itself makes no claim as to who is writing the book. The writer never writes in the first person, unlike the writer of the book of Luke, who appears at the beginning in the first person. I have carefully investigated these things. So the manner of writing in the book of Matthew resembles writings in the Jewish scriptures that are narrated in the third person style of narration, where the writer does not speak in the first person. This manner of writing presumes that the content is much more important than the person who is writing it. So in this regard, the title of the book appears to be somewhat in tension with the book. The book and its title seem at odds in what they claim. So while externally the book is associated with the name Mattheos, internally it is written in an anonymous style. This is what scholars mean when they say that the text itself is formally anonymous. Now, Richard Bauckham suggests that although the book is written in an anonymous style, it was never intended to be thought of as having an anonymous writer. Bauckham argues for pseudonymity. That is, the earliest readers presumed that the book was written in the name of Matthew. Bauckham suggests that the author of the book was not the Apostle Matthew, but he wanted to associate the book with the Apostle Matthew, either claiming to be written by the Apostle Matthew or claiming to be written using source material that goes back to the Apostle Matthew. It's unclear whether Bauckham is saying that the Apostle Matthew functioned as a written source or an oral source. It's unclear the precise role that Bauckham's arguing for. Now, the reason that Bauckham says the author certainly treats the Apostle Matthew as in some way source is based on the fact that the figure of Matthew receives a higher profile in Matthew. In no other book is Matthew called the tax collector. In no other book does the name Matthew get mentioned outside the list of the names of the 12. But in the book of Matthew, the disciple Matthew has a short story about his calling from tax collector to follower of Jesus. Bauckham suggests that if we combine this with the fact that the book has become associated with the name Matthew, this is unlikely to be a coincidence. Bauckham suggests that the writer is deliberately pointing out Matthew and wanting readers to associate the book with the figure of Matthew. In other words, the book represents Matthean source material, and we should think of the book as pseudonymous rather than anonymous. I would add a couple of comments to Bauckham's theory. From what I can see, the writer is not very interested in self-promotion, which probably supports Bauckham's idea of pseudonymity, where the writer is promoting his source, promoting the name of the Apostle Matthew as a source, or in my opinion, an alleged source. Why promote or allege the Apostle Matthew as a source? Perhaps the answer might have something to do with literacy. It could perhaps be something to do with the apostles' alleged ability to write. None of the other apostles are considered literate. None of them are thought to be able to read or write. But identifying Matthew as the tax collector might possibly suggest that he was literate. So it could be saying, of all the disciples listed, one of them was literate, and that was Matthew the tax collector. He was the one in the position to collect sayings of Jesus. The problem with this theory is a tax collector from a small town of Capernaum. A toll booth worker in Capernaum would not need to be very literate in Greek. He would only need enough Greek for verbal communication. But perhaps this distinction or graduation in literacy skills is not something that we can expect everyone to appreciate. If most people can't read or write, then maybe indicating some literacy skills is enough to say Matthew was the one who started collecting sayings of Jesus. There's one more thing I'd like to do in part 2, and that is to compare the Matthew in the book with the Matthew in the book's title. It's interesting to read the Matthew in the book in terms of what the name Matthew means in Hebrew, and then, on the other hand, to read the Matthew in the book title in terms of what the name sounds like as a possible Greek word. If we think of names as intended to honor someone, it's interesting to read the name of Matthew in terms of what the name Matthew means in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the name Matthew honors the God of Israel. It means gift of the Lord. It's possible that Matthew is significant due to the meaning of his name, but notice the contrast with the second part of his name, his epithet, the tax collector. Perhaps the call story of Matthew has more similarities with the call story of the fishermen, Simon Peter and his brother Andrew. In the call of the first two disciples, it's pointed out about their transition from catching fish to catching humans. Perhaps we might see a similar highlighting of Matthew's transition in occupation. Looking at the passage that contains the figure of Matthew, well, there are two passages. The first seems to be about authority and systems of power. Jesus sees someone sitting in a position of power at the toll booth. But this man is not a Roman. He is within the clutches of Rome and helping Rome, but he is not a Roman. He is a local Jewish man, and he has a name, Matthew. And Jesus calls him, and he follows. Then Jesus heals numerous people, And then Jesus sends out 12 disciples on a mission. Just before we hear about this mission, we hear about the names of the 12 missionaries, and Matthew is one of the 12. The contrast between the meaning of his name in Hebrew with his despised occupation is noteworthy. Matthew, gift of the Lord, the tax collector, the one who takes money from his fellow Jews and gives it to the Romans. There's the idea that the God of Israel has given, whereas Rome has taken. His Hebrew name honors God, but can it be said that his epithet honors Rome? No. By name, Matthew acknowledges God as benefactor. By trade, he acknowledges Rome as monopolizer. His Hebrew name honors God as gift giver, while his occupation exposes Rome as power-hungry puppet master. What looks initially like a contradiction of names is, on closer inspection, not a contradiction, because tax collector does not honor Rome's power. Roman authority is superficial and secondary. God as gift giver precedes Roman taxation. The name Matthew, the tax collector, symbolizes the contrast of two systems of power, two kinds of authority. And notice how Jesus changes the situation. And it's not so much about converting Matthew. It's not about his conversion so much as it is about his recovery or restoration. We could read it in an individual sense, whereby a local Hebrew guy regains his true identity by changing his occupation. He goes from working for the Romans to working for Jesus and Jesus' mission. Matthew changes his allegiance from the mission of taxation for Rome to Jesus' mission, thereby being true to his Hebrew roots. But we probably should read it in a representative sense. Matthew is representative of a people who have lost a healthy sense of self-identity as a people. As a people, they have been subjugated, overtaxed, have lost their sense of well-being as a nation. It's not surprising then that soon after Matthew is called, that we hear about the mission of the 12, where Matthew is assigned a more authentic Hebrew role within Jesus' mission to restore the lost sheep of Israel. Jesus' mission to restore the people of Israel under God's reign. They are to continue doing what Jesus has been doing, healing the sick, raising the dead, cleansing lepers, casting out demons, and they are to do so without charging, without requiring payment. This is the opposite of taxation. This is a gift from the Lord. They are to bring a message of restoration, and to bring this restoration, they are to show that their words and deeds are united. Message and medium are united here. The medium is the message. So I see a symbolism here of the name Matthew, the tax taker, as representing the story of Jesus' mission towards restoring the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Pointing out that Matthew had been taking taxes for Rome before meeting Jesus seems to give us essentially the story of the book in miniature, in microcosm. The essence of Jesus' mission to restore the lost sheep of Israel is found in contemplating the two-part name, Matthew, the tax collector, especially within the context of the list of the 12 missionaries that Jesus sends out to proclaim the arrival of the greatest kingdom, heaven's kingdom. The story is not about a converting of a people here, but a mission of recovery of what was lost. Likewise, Matthew, the tax taker on behalf of Rome, is being restored to gift given on behalf of the Lord of Israel. Okay, so what about the Matthew in the book's title? Here the name Matthew appears without the epithet the tax collector. It's just Matthew, the Evangel According to Matthew. It is possible to read Matthew as a Greek word. And this would make more sense when the Gospel titles were standardized in the mid-2nd century. Not everyone would know that Matthew was a Hebrew word. They might hear it as a Greek word, and as a Greek word it sounds like the word for disciple or student or discipleship. It sounds like it's a word that's related to the word learn or learning from the Greek word disciple, mathetes. So it could sound like the gospel according to studentship, discipleship. And if we completely ignore spelling, then Mattheos also sounds like it contains the word for God or divinity. Now, rather than simply gift of God, Matthew is student of God, learner of God, or disciple of God. And this seems appropriate to the teaching emphasis in the book, with its 5 large teaching sections on learning about godly living through listening to what Jesus says about God. In the book, Jesus is the number 1 teacher of divinity. Jesus says, your one teacher is the Christos. If Jesus is the ideal teacher of divinity, then Matthew is the student, the ideal student of divinity. Part 3. In Part 3, I had originally planned to draw some conclusions about the authorship of the book and my opinion of how the book was authored, but I've abandoned that idea. Instead, I'm just going to offer some questions for consideration, partly because I'm keen to get to verse 1, and partly because I feel it's appropriate to the theme of this episode. I want to encourage listeners to think about pretext in terms of not only in what comes before verse 1, but what comes before our reading of the text, our presuppositions about what it is that we are reading, and how we are going to engage with the text. So in this section, instead of trying to come to conclusions, I'd like to muse a little. Questions to ponder. We could think about the previous section as asking us to reconsider how we think about the name of the book and its relation to the book. How much do we imagine that the content of the book is determined by the name of the book? Does the book's title encourage readers to think about the book's genre as gospel? Does having 4 uniform book titles encourage us to think about the genre as being the same, or does it allow room for us to consider that each book might be a different genre? How much room do we allow for the genre of the book of Matthew as different from the genre of Mark or Luke or John? How do we think of the gospel story? A message apparently of welfare, but is it a message of conversion? Or is it a message of restoration? And if it was originally a message for Jewish people, then how do I, as a non-Jewish person, read the book? Do I identify more with the non-Jewish characters than with the Jewish characters in the book? Do readers think they are reading a book written by a former tax collector? And what do we think about the author of the book in terms of his gender or his background? Do we think of the book's composition as a single moment of composition? Or do we see it as reflecting a long process of composition? How do we think of the book's source material? Do we think of the content that's also the same content from the Gospel of Mark Do we think of that content as being reused or recycled in the book of Matthew? Recycled in a positive sense or in a negative sense? By reusing so much of the book of Mark, was the writer demonstrating approval or disapproval of the book of Mark? Is this constructive criticism or deconstructive criticism? Can we understand the book without knowing about the author? Can we hold the tension between the two portraits of the book's author, the traditional portrait of Matthew the tax collector and the scholarly portrait of Matthew the trained scribe? Do we need to think of them as opposing perspectives? They are definitely both hypothetical portraits. Which portrait do we prefer, and why do we prefer it? Perhaps there is something appealing about this Matthew. In reality, every interpreter of Matthew develops their own portrait of the authorship. Does our theory of composition of the book make a difference to our interpretation of the book? If so, how so? What about the divine voice in the text? The idea that the text is not just speaking with the voice of a man, a male author, but is speaking with and on behalf of many voices, including the divine voice. Do we see the book as reflecting a collection of voices from a community, collected from a spectrum of voices, as traditions that are collected from and within a community? So is Matthew the writer writing on behalf of a whole community of traditions? Are we comfortable supposing that the writer was a successful spokesperson, or was successful because of his gender, speaking to and for men and women? Are we comfortable in thinking that such a writer can speak successfully on behalf of everyone, all in a community? The title Gospel According to Matthew sounds like it is the opinion of Matthew, or as if one man has determined the material, or which material to include. Is this a case of what I was talking about at the beginning of the episode? Are we faced with a man presenting the story, but then expect to consider that his gender is unimportant? His masculinity is completely irrelevant? Is this just another example of men thinking that their gender is irrelevant because they are men? The profile of the author is always open-ended, always ready to be revised. Do we let go of the idea of being able to get a decent profile of the author? Perhaps we can read the book as offering a variety of voices, despite the book's title. The scholarly construct of an anonymous author is an author that remains less easily known in terms of having any physicality. Such an author is rather disembodied. Is he another disembodied male, speaking as a male voice, alleging to be neutral? Or is this anonymity a chance for us to question the gender of the author? Does the author of an anonymous text have to be a man? The disembodied voice of the narrator can be considered to not belong to any one body, which in itself is something that is potentially unsettling in both positive ways and negative ways. Thanks for listening to this episode. As we begin on verse 1 next episode, I would like to encourage listeners to consider what kind of author they have in mind. For an ancient writer, the opening words of the book were often enough to identify the content of the book. Next episode, I'll be discussing the first verse of Matthew.